tastes like cheap copper and stale coffee. Nora sprinted across the marble lobby, the heavy thud of her ex-boyfriend's boots echoing too close behind her. She hammered the elevator button, praying for a metal shield. When the polished doors finally parted, she didn't look. She just threw herself inside. But she wasn't alone. The man standing in the corner wasn't a savior. He was a predator, and the doors had just locked her in his cage. Lungs burning, Nora skidded past a towering arrangement of white orchids, her stockinged feet slipping terribly on the high-gloss marble. She had abandoned her heels somewhere near the coat check. The right one had snapped when she lunged away from Derek's grasp in the bar, leaving a bright red welt across her ankle. Now she just needed to disappear. Behind her, the sharp shatter of a highball glass against a decorative pillar cut through the low hum of the hotel's ambient jazz. Nora. Derek's voice was a wet, ragged tear in the quiet atmosphere of the luxury foyer. He was close, too close. She could hear the heavy, uneven drag of his right foot, a careless limp he only adopted when he was 4 whiskeys deep and looking to break something. Usually it was her pride. Tonight, looking at the deadness in his eyes back at the table, she knew it was going to be her jaw. She rounded the corner to the elevator bank, her breath ripping through her throat in ragged, uneven gasps. The alcove was empty, lined with brushed steel doors that reflected her own ruined image back at her. Mascara smeared beneath her left eye, her dark hair clinging to the cold sweat on her neck. The silk of her slip dress twisted awkwardly around her hips. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman running for her life in a place where people usually came to relax. Her thumb jammed into the glowing plastic uppy button, pressing it repeatedly until her nail bed turned completely white. It wouldn't make the car arrive any faster, but the physical action gave her a focal point outside her own terror. Above the center doors, the digital display mocked her with its slow descent. 8, 7, 6. "I see you, you stupid bitch," Derek slurred from the hallway she had just exited. The sound of his heavy frame colliding with the wall echoed toward her. He was clumsy, but he was relentlessly strong. Nora pressed her forehead against the cool steel of the elevator doors. The metal was freezing against her flushed skin. She squeezed her eyes shut. 5, 4. The scent of spilled bourbon and Derek's cheap, overpowering cologne seemed to drift around the corner before he did. Her stomach roiled. She curled her arms around her ribs, a defensive posture she took without thinking, protecting her softest parts. She needed to breathe, but inhaling felt like swallowing glass. 3, 2. A heavy hand slammed against the polished mahogany paneling just outside the elevator alcove. Derek stumbled into view. His tie loosened his face, a mottled, furious red. He saw her. A vicious, ugly smile cracked across his face, exposing teeth stained with dark liquor. "Running!" he wheezed, pushing himself off the wall. "Really?" 1. The soft melodic ding of the elevator arriving sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. The heavy steel doors began to part with an agonizing slowness. Nora didn't wait for them to open fully. She squeezed through the narrow gap, her shoulder scraping painfully against the metal frame, and threw herself backward into the car. She slammed her hand blindly against the control panel, hitting the close door button with the heel of her palm over and over. "Come on, come on, come on!" she whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic wet sob. Derek lunged forward. His heavy boots pounded against the marble. He was 20 feet away. 10, 5. The doors shuddered, reversed for a fraction of a second, and then finally blessedly began to slide shut. Derek reached out his thick, bruised fingers, extending toward the closing gap. For a sickening moment, Nora thought he was going to catch the edge of the door, trigger the sensor, and pry it back open. But he was a second too late. The doors clamped shut with a heavy, definitive thud. A second later, the muffled sound of Derek's fists pounding against the outside steel vibrated through the car. Bang, bang, bang. Nora collapsed against the back wall of the elevator, her legs giving out completely. She slid down the mirrored glass until she hit the carpeted floor, bringing her knees to her chest. She wrapped her arms around her shins and buried her face in her knees, violently shaking as the adrenaline peaked and began a nauseating crash. She was safe. The thick walls of the elevator muffled Derek's muffled screaming into nothingness as the car lurched upward. The oppressive, terrifying noise of the lobby was gone, replaced by the smooth, mechanical hum of the cables and the rush of air conditioning. It took 30 seconds for her to realize the air didn't smell like the sterile, recycled ozone typical of hotel elevators. It smelled like cedar, and cold, metallic smoke, and expensive tailored wool. Nora froze. The shaking in her hands stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, instinctual stillness. She hadn't looked when she jumped in. She had just assumed the car was empty. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head from her knees. Standing in the opposite corner of the spacious mahogany-paneled elevator was a man. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He had simply stood there and watched her throw herself into the car, slam the buttons, and collapse onto the floor in a weeping heap. He was leaning casually against the brass railing, his hands resting in the pockets of a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car. He wasn't looking at her with pity or confusion or the mild annoyance of a disrupted hotel guest. His eyes were entirely flat, dark, impenetrable, and terrifyingly calm. Gravity pressed heavily against Nora's chest as the elevator accelerated upward. The digital floor indicator blinked rapidly, 4, 5, 6 each number, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic click. The silence inside the cabin was thick, almost pressurized. It felt heavier than the chaotic noise of the lobby she had just escaped. Nora remained on the floor, her back glued to the cold mirror, staring at the man in the corner. Her brain, sluggish and swimming in leftover adrenaline, struggled to process him. He didn't fit the environment. The hotel was upscale, yes, but it catered to loud corporate retreats and flashy weddings. This man possessed a stillness that felt dangerous. His suit was immaculately cut, hugging broad shoulders and a lean torso, but it was the way he wore it like armor he was entirely comfortable in. His tie was absent, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone, revealing a faint dark shadow of ink resting just over his collarbone. "Are you finished?" His voice was a low, resonant rumble. It didn't bounce off the walls, it seemed to absorb into them. There was no inflection of concern. It was a simple factual inquiry, delivered with the casual boredom of someone asking for the time. Nora opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. A small, pathetic squeak escaped her lips instead of words. She swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of fear again, and forced herself to nod. The man didn't react. He just kept watching her with those flat, dark eyes. Nora felt a sudden sharp prickle of shame slice through her lingering terror. She was sitting on the floor of a public elevator, in a ruined dress, barefoot, her face streaked with tears and cheap makeup. She scrambled to get up, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Her stockings slipped on the plush carpet, and she pitched forward, slightly catching herself on the brass handrail. She stood, pressing her spine against the paneling, putting as much distance between them as the small box allowed. She looked away from him, fixing her gaze on the glowing floor numbers. 12. 13. "You're bleeding," he stated. Nora flinched. She looked down. The side of her arm where she had scraped it against the elevator doorframe during her dive was oozing a thin line of red. She hadn't even felt it. She lifted a trembling hand and pressed her thumb against the cut, smearing the blood across her pale skin. "I'm fine," she whispered. Her voice sounded gravelly and foreign to her own ears. The man slowly pulled his right hand from his pocket. The overhead halogen light caught the heavy, dull silver of a signet ring on his index finger. Nora's eyes tracked the movement instinctively. The ring bore a deeply engraved crest, a wolf's head tangled in thorns. Her breath hitched. The air conditioning suddenly felt freezing. She lived in this city. You didn't live here, work in the downtown service industry, and read the local news without knowing what that crest meant. It belonged to the Cassio family. They owned the ports, half the real estate in the financial district, and if the whispers were true, the police department. They weren't just wealthy. They were untouchable and ruthless. She finally looked at his face properly. The sharp, aristocratic jaw, the slight, arrogant curve of his nose, the dark, unforgiving eyes. Dominic Cassio, the eldest son, the one the papers called the quiet architect of the family's recent violent expansion. Nora's knees threatened to buckle again. She had traded a drunk, abusive ex-boyfriend for a man who ordered people buried in concrete. The sheer absurdity of it made a hysterical, broken laugh bubble up in her chest. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle it, biting down hard on her own flesh until the pain grounded her. Dominic's head tilted a fraction of an inch. It was the first real movement he had made since she entered the car. He analyzed her reaction, watching the dawning realization spread across her face, watching the terror shift from acute panic to a deep, paralyzing dread. "You recognize me," he observed. Again, a statement, not a question. Nora didn't answer. She couldn't. She just stared at him, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. "Who was the man in the lobby?" Dominic asked. He wasn't interrogating her. He was merely collecting data. Nora stopped. Her throat clicked. "My ex." Dominic let out a small, dismissive exhale through his nose. He looked away from her, turning his attention to the brushed steel doors. He lacks discipline, beating his fists against reinforced steel. Uncivilized. Nora stared at his profile. The casual way he dismissed Derek's rage was chilling. Derek was a monster in her world, a force of nature she had spent months tiptoeing around. To Dominic Cassio, Derek was nothing more than an annoying insect making too much noise against a window. 22, 23. The elevator was slowing down. Nora felt the slight shift in gravity. She looked at the control panel. The highest button pressed was for the penthouse suite. Floor 40. But the car was stopping. The soft ding chimed again. The digital display read 25. Nora hadn't pressed to 25. Neither had he. The doors began to slide open, revealing the dimly lit, plushly carpeted hallway of the residential suites. Nora's muscles tensed, ready to bolt. This was her chance. She could run out, find a stairwell, hide. But as the doors opened fully, she saw two men standing in the hallway blocking the exit. They were massive, dressed in dark suits, their hands folded neatly in front of them. Their eyes flicked to Nora for a fraction of a second, before settling respectfully on Dominic. Nora stopped dead. She was trapped. She looked back at Dominic. He didn't move toward the door. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto hers, holding her gaze with a weight that made her want to sink back into the floor. "It seems," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, smoothing out into something dangerously soft. "You've run out of places to run." Panic locked her joints into rigid, useless angles. Nora remained frozen against the mirrored back wall of the elevator, her bare foot hovering an inch above the plush carpet. The two men in the hallway hadn't moved a muscle. They were built like freight trains, their dark suits straining slightly across broad chests, hands folded with military precision. They didn't glare. They didn't threaten. They just existed, a solid wall of muscle and tailored wool, blocking her only visible exit. Dominic Cassio finally shifted his weight. He didn't rush. He didn't even look back at her as he stepped out of the car. His movements were terrifyingly fluid, possessing the lazy, deliberate grace of a predator, completely unbothered by its surroundings. The heavy scent of cedar and expensive smoke drifted out with him, leaving the air inside the cabin feeling suddenly thin and sterile. He walked past the two men. They parted instantly, creating a silent, respectful corridor for him to pass through. Nora stared at the glowing control panel. The close door button was 3 feet away. If she lunged for it, if she slammed her hand against it, she could ride this metal box back down. Back down to the lobby. Back down to the shattered glass, the screaming, and the heavy bruised hands of a man who knew exactly how to hurt her, without leaving marks that showed outside her clothes. One of the guards, the taller one with a faint, pale scar slicing through his left eyebrow, slowly raised his arm. He placed a massive, calloused hand flat against the rubber edge of the open elevator door. The sensor beeped, a high-pitched, steady warning. The door wasn't going to close. "You can ride back down to the lobby." Dominic's voice drifted back from the dim corridor. He hadn't stopped walking. He was already several yards away, his back turned to her. Though I suspect the man throwing glassware is currently waiting by the reception desk. Or you can step out. The choice is yours. It wasn't a choice. It was a trap perfectly designed to look like an open door. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. A fresh wave of nausea rolled over her, sour and hot in the back of her throat. She hated Derek. She hated him with a visceral, acidic intensity that burned her from the inside out. But she understood his violence. It was sloppy, fueled by alcohol and bruised ego. It was loud. Dominic Cassio's world was entirely different. She managed the floor at a high-end steakhouse downtown. She had seen men like him come in. Men who tipped in crisp $100 bills, who spoke softly to the waitstaff, and who radiated a quiet, gravitational pull of pure danger. You didn't look them in the eye. You poured the wine, you nodded, and you made yourself invisible. Now she was bleeding in his hallway. She opened her eyes. The guard's hand remained on the door. He was looking at a point on the wall just above her head, waiting with infinite patience. Slowly Nora peeled her spine away from the mirror. Her right ankle throbbed with a sharp, sickening spike of pain as she put weight on it. She winced, biting down on her lower lip until she tasted copper. She limped forward, favoring her good leg, her torn silk dress whispering against her thighs. As she crossed the threshold, the guard dropped his hand. The elevator doors slid shut behind her with a soft, dismissive click. The finality of the sound made her stomach drop. She was on the 25th floor. No keycard, no shoes, no phone. The hallway was muted, wrapped in dark, textured wallpaper and lit by low-wattage sconces that cast long, distorting shadows. The carpet beneath her bare foot was thick enough to swallow the sound of her uneven footsteps. Dominic was waiting at the end of the corridor. He stood before a set of massive double doors made of dark, polished oak. He had a keycard in his hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He watched her approach. He didn't offer a hand, and he didn't offer sympathy. He simply observed her slow, painful progress with the detached interest of a scientist watching a wounded insect drag itself across a slide. "My ankle." Nora rasped, her voice catching on the dry air. She didn't know why she said it. An excuse, maybe. A plea for a second of grace. "I can see that," Dominic replied. His tone was perfectly flat. He pressed the card against the black reader. A small green light blinked, followed by the heavy mechanical thud of a deadbolt disengaging. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, leaving it ajar for her. The two guards took up positions on either side of the hallway, their backs to the oak doors. They weren't coming in. They were making sure she didn't come out. Nora reached the doorway. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight with a mixture of exhaustion and acute, vibrating terror. She placed her hand on the heavy wood frame, her fingers trembling against the smooth polish. She looked into the suite. It was dark, save for the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, glittering view of the city skyline. It looked less like a hotel room and more like a high-altitude vault. She took a deep breath, the scent of his cologne stronger here, mingling with the smell of leather and rain against glass. There was no turning back. Derek was the devil she knew, but he was a devil of the dirt. She was stepping into the sky. Nora crossed the threshold, her bare foot sinking into the cold hardwood floor. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing the quiet around them like a vacuum. Silence in the suite possessed a heavy, suffocating weight. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty room. It was the tense, coiled stillness of a drawn bowstring. Nora stood frozen just inside the doorway, her arms wrapped defensively around her waist. The ambient light from the city below spilled across the stark, minimalist furniture, sharp angles of brushed steel, dark leather, and polished slate. There were no paintings on the walls, no scattered magazines, no evidence that a human being actually lived here. It was a holding cell dressed in $10,000 worth of upholstery. Dominic had moved to a sleek, marble-topped island that separated the entryway from the sprawling living space. He shrugged off his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over the back of a bar stool. The holster strapped to his ribs was black leather, the dark metal of a handgun, resting securely against his crisp white shirt. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't even acknowledge it. It was just a part of his wardrobe. Nora's eyes locked onto the weapon, her throat constricted. The reality of who she was, locked in a room with, hit her again, harder this time, completely stripping away the lingering shock of her escape from Derek. "Sit." The command broke the silence like a snapped twig. Dominic wasn't looking at her. He was opening a heavy flush-mounted cabinet above the sink. Nora didn't argue. Her right ankle was screaming, sending hot flares of pain up her calf with every heartbeat. She hobbled toward a low-slung charcoal-grey sofa that faced the massive windows. She practically collapsed onto the cushions. The leather was freezing against the bare skin of her thighs. She curled into the corner of the couch, pulling her knees up tight against her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. She heard the sound of running water, then the rustle of plastic. A moment later, Dominic walked around the island. He carried a rectangular black plastic case and a damp white towel. He didn't sit beside her. Instead, he pulled a heavy glass and steel coffee table closer to the couch, with one hand, the metal legs scraping loudly against the hardwood. He sat on the edge of the table directly facing her. The proximity was jarring. He was close enough that she could see the faint, silvery lines of old scars woven into the knuckles of his hands. He flipped the latches on the medical kit. "Give me your arm." Nora flinched, pulling her injured arm tighter against her ribs. The scrape from the elevator door had stopped freely bleeding, but the skin was raw angry and crusted with drying blood. "I'm fine. It just needs soap." Dominic paused. He looked up from the open kit, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was no irritation in his gaze, just a cold, heavy pressure. "I am not asking for your medical opinion. Give me your arm or I will take it. One takes considerably less effort." The blunt, casual threat drained the fight right out of her. She was too tired. Her adrenaline reserves were empty, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. Slowly she uncurled her arm and extended it toward him, her hand trembling violently. He took her wrist. His grip was entirely impersonal, firm, slightly rough, but lacking any cruel pressure. His fingers were surprisingly warm against her cold skin. He dragged the damp towel over the wound. Nora hissed her back, arching off the cushions as the pain flared. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice dropping a fraction. It wasn't comforting. It was an instruction. He discarded the towel and pulled a sealed alcohol wipe from the kit. He tore it open with his teeth, his eyes never leaving the angry scrape on her bicep. "You fight like a cornered stray." Nora's jaw tightened. The scent of the antiseptic hit her nose, sharp and clinical. "I was running for my life." "You were running blindly," he corrected, pressing the alcohol pad directly into the raw flesh. She gasped loudly, her free hand digging into the leather upholstery, as tears of pure, stinging pain sprang to her eyes. She tried to pull her arm back instinctively, but his grip tightened, locking her wrist in place like a steel vice. "You didn't look before you jumped into the car." Dominic continued his tone, conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than cleaning a wound. "You didn't assess the threat inside. You simply reacted to the noise behind you. It's a good way to get yourself killed. Because you're so much better!" She snapped, the pain overriding her common sense. The cynical, jagged edge of her personality, the part Derek had spent 2 years trying to beat out of her, flared up. "You're just going to patch me up and let me go." The great Dominic Cassio, playing Florence Nightingale. He paused. The alcohol wipe hovered an inch above her skin. He slowly lifted his head. The flat, dead look in his eyes shifted, replaced by a dark, dangerous spark of amusement. It wasn't a smile, but the tension in his jaw relaxed slightly. "You have a sharp tongue for a woman bleeding on a stranger's couch," he observed. "I've had a bad night," she muttered, refusing to look away, even as her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He dropped the bloody wipe onto the table and pulled a square of gauze from the kit. "I am not patching you up out of a sense of charity," he said, taping the edges of the bandage down with precise, efficient movements. "You were bleeding on my shoes. I dislike messes." Nora let out a dry, broken bark of laughter. It sounded pathetic in the large, empty room. "Right. God forbid I ruin the Italian leather." Dominic released her wrist. He leaned back slightly, his eyes doing a slow, calculating sweep of her face. The smeared mascara, the bruised exhaustion under her eyes, the cynical twist of her lips. "Your arm is clean," he stated, closing the medical kit with a sharp snap. "Now we need to discuss the fact that the man downstairs is currently breaking hotel property, looking for something that is currently sitting in my living room. And I need to decide if you are worth the inconvenience of dealing with him." Air caught in Nora's throat, forming a sharp, painful knot. She stared at the man, perched on the edge of the glass table. He wasn't talking about a misplaced watch or a stolen envelope. He was talking about her. "I'm not a thing," she said, the words slipping out before her common sense could catch them. Her voice was brittle, lacking the strength to be a proper demand, but the defiance was there, buried under the exhaustion. Dominic Cassio didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, matte black phone. He tapped the screen once, illuminating the harsh angles of his face in the blue glow. "At this exact moment, you are a liability, wearing a ruined dress sitting on my furniture. To the man downstairs, you are property. To me, you are an unexpected variable. So yes, currently, you are a thing to be managed." He set the phone down on the glass. The screen showed a live security feed. It was split into 4 grid squares. The bottom right square displayed the hotel lobby. Nora leaned forward involuntarily, her breath hitching. There was Derek. He was standing near the concierge desk, his face red and sweating aggressively, pointing a thick finger at a terrified-looking night clerk. Even without audio, Nora could read the violent, jerky movements of his shoulders. He was demanding access. He was demanding her. "He's going to find out what floor this went to," she whispered, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of her neck. He knows the bartender. He knows people here. He's going to find out I came up. Let him find out, Dominic said. He picked up his phone again, his thumb hovering over the screen. The elevators require encrypted keycards to access the penthouses. The stairwells are locked from the outside. If he somehow bypasses both, he meets the two men you saw in the hallway. If he survives them, which he won't, he meets me. He looked up from the screen, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a heavy, suffocating pressure. Your ex-boyfriend is loud. Loud men are rarely as dangerous as they think they are. They rely on fear. Take away the fear, and they are just meat-making noise. Nora shrank back into the cushions. It was a terrifyingly accurate assessment of Derek, delivered by a man who clearly dealt in a much colder, more absolute kind of violence. You don't understand him. He doesn't just give up. If his pride is hurt, he will tear the building apart. Let him try to tear my building apart, Dominic replied softly. The possessive pronoun sent a chill down Nora's spine. My building. Of course, the Cassio family didn't just rent penthouses, they owned the real estate beneath them. She had run from a bully in a bar straight into the lap of the landlord of the city's underworld. Why are you letting me stay? The question tasted like ash. She squeezed her good arm around her ribs, shivering, as the adrenaline finally left her system, entirely leaving behind a profound, hollow ache. You said I'm an inconvenience, so throw me out. Give me to your guards to escort out the back. Why am I sitting here? Dominic studied her. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. He wasn't looking at her chest or her legs. He was looking at her eyes, searching for something specific in the exhausted, cynical depths of her gaze. Because you didn't beg, he said finally. The words were quiet, but they carried a strange, heavy weight. When the doors closed, you didn't ask me to save you. You didn't weep for a champion. You assessed the threat, recognized who I was, and you evaluated your odds. He tilted his head slightly. I detest weakness, but I respect survival. Nora let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, a clinical categorization of her behavior. He stood up the movement, smooth and silent. He pocketed his phone and picked up his discarded suit jacket from the bar stool. There is a guest bedroom down the hall to the left. The bathroom has clean towels. I suggest you wash the blood off your leg and try to sleep. The men outside will remain there until morning. And then, Nora asked, her voice tight. What happens tomorrow? Dominic turned back to her, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the hallway frame. The dim lighting carved harsh shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. Tomorrow the noise downstairs will be gone, and you will walk out the front door. What happens to you after that is entirely your concern. He didn't wait for a response. He walked down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows of the massive suite. Nora sat alone in the sprawling, silent living room. The city lights glittered indifferently through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked down at her hands. They were still shaking. She was safe for the night, protected by a monster who found her survival instincts mildly amusing. It was the most transactional hollow safety she had ever felt yet, as she listened to the dead quiet of the apartment. A strange, terrible sense of relief washed over her. She wasn't going to be hit tonight. For the first time in 6 months, that was enough. Footsteps barely registered on the thick charcoal carpeting as Nora limped down the dim hallway. The guest room was exactly as sterile and unyielding as the living area. It featured a massive king-sized bed, practically swallowed by tight, stark white linens, a heavy oak dresser, and 0 personal touches. It felt like a high-end furniture showroom, She bypassed the bed entirely and headed straight for the attached bathroom. Pushing the heavy frosted glass door open, she was met with cold slate tiles and the sharp, clean scent of eucalyptus. Nora leaned heavily against the marble vanity, her hands gripping the cool edges. She finally looked at herself in the mirror. The sight made her stomach turn. Her dark hair was a tangled, matted mess clinging to her forehead. Her mascara had dried into dark, jagged cracks down her cheeks, making her look bruised and hollowed out. The silk slip dress, which had cost her a week's tips, was torn at the seam and stained with a mixture of spilled liquor and her own blood. She looked like a victim. She hated it. With trembling fingers, she reached around and unzipped the dress, letting it pool around her bruised ankles. She stepped out of it, kicking the ruined silk into the corner of the room with a sudden flare of disgust. She turned on the shower. The water pressure was heavy and instant, quickly filling the large glass enclosure with thick, warm steam. Nora stepped under the spray, gasping as the hot water hit the raw scrape on her arm and the welt on her ankle. It stung violently, a sharp, cleansing pain that cut through the lingering numbness in her brain. She scrubbed her skin until it turned a flushed, angry pink, using a heavy block of cedar-scented soap she found in the marble alcove. It smelled exactly like him. The scent was masculine, dark, and intrusive, clinging to her skin no matter how hard she tried to wash it away. It felt like a brand. When she finally turned off the water, the silence of the suite pressed in on her again. She wrapped herself in a thick, oversized white towel and stepped back into the bedroom. She had no clothes. She couldn't put the torn, liquor-soaked dress back on, but she also couldn't sleep naked in a bed, owned by a man who ordered executions with his morning espresso. Nora hesitated, then padded over to the heavy oak dresser. She pulled the top drawer open. It wasn't empty. Neatly folded rows of men's T-shirts, mostly black and charcoal grey, sat perfectly aligned. They felt impossibly soft under her fingertips, a heavy, expensive cotton blend. She pulled a black one out. It was huge. She pulled it over her head, the hem falling halfway down her thighs, swallowing her slender frame entirely. The fabric carried the faint, lingering scent of the cedar soap. She crawled into the massive bed, pulling the heavy duvet up to her chin. The mattress was firm, the pillows smelled like fresh ozone, and the room was completely, utterly silent. No traffic noise penetrated the thick glass. No heavy footsteps stomped in the apartment above. No sound of shattering glass. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, her brain replayed the frantic sprint across the lobby. She felt the heavy thud of Derek's boots behind her. She felt the cold steel of the elevator doors against her back. And then she saw the flat, dead eyes of Dominic Cassio watching her from the corner. By 2 a.m, her throat felt like sandpaper. The heavy, dry air conditioning of the penthouse was dehydrating her. Nora pushed the duvet back. Her ankle throbbed a dull, steady rhythm as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She needed water. She needed to move. Staying still was making the anxiety claw at the insides of her chest. She stepped out into the hallway, moving slowly, favoring her uninjured leg. The suite was pitch black, save for the ambient glow of the city filtering through the living room windows. She navigated by memory toward the kitchen island. Her bare feet made no sound on the hardwood. She rounded the edge of the marble counter and stopped dead. Dominic was sitting in a low leather chair near the window, a crystal tumbler resting loosely in his right hand. He wasn't wearing the dress shirt anymore. He wore a simple dark grey T-shirt that stretched across the broad, tense lines of his shoulders. The ambient light caught the intricate dark ink of the tattoos wrapping around his left forearm, sharp geometric lines mixed with heavy shadowed shading. He hadn't turned a light on. He was simply staring out at the sprawling, glittering grid of the city, sitting in perfect, terrifying stillness. The water is filtered through the tap. His voice broke the silence, low and rough, barely louder than a rasp. He didn't turn his head. He had known she was there before she even crossed the threshold of the living room. Nora swallowed hard. Her heart kicked up a panicked rhythm. "Sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. I don't sleep," he replied, taking a slow sip from the tumbler. The ice clinked sharply against the glass. Nora moved behind the island, her movements stiff and hyper-aware. She found a glass in the cabinet he had left open earlier and filled it from the heavy brass faucet. She took a long, desperate drink, the cold water soothing her burning throat. She should go back to the room. She knew she should. But the strange, charged gravity of the space held her in place. She looked at his profile, the sharp jawline, the arrogant slope of his nose, the complete lack of tension in his posture. "Did he leave?" she asked, her voice small in the cavernous room. Dominic slowly turned his head. His dark eyes dragged over her, taking in the oversized black t-shirt, her bare, bruised legs, the damp hair falling around her shoulders. His gaze was heavy or physical, like a hand dragging across her skin. "Yes," Dominic said, softly, turning back to the window. He made a scene. "My men removed him from the premises. He is currently nursing a fractured cheekbone in the back of a taxi." Nora's breath hitched. A fractured cheekbone. "You had them hurt him." "I had them take out the trash," Dominic corrected coldly. "Trash usually gets dented when you throw it to the curb." He took another sip of his drink. "Go to sleep, Nora. Tomorrow you disappear." Sunlight bleached the guest room into a blinding, sterile white, slicing through the gap in the heavy curtains. Nora woke with a violent jolt. Her heart kicked against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, before her brain finally caught up to her surroundings. Heavy, cool cotton sheets. Complete silence. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, wincing as the skin on her scraped bicep pulled tight. The bandage was still perfectly adhered, a small white square of clinical efficiency. Her right ankle throbbed with a dull, heavy rhythm. When she threw back the duvet and looked down, the skin around, the joint, was painted in ugly mottled shades of purple and yellow. The oversized black t-shirt twisted around her waist. It still smelled intensely of cedar, and that cold, metallic ozone scent that seemed to radiate from Dominic Cassio. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood. Every muscle in her body ached thick with the chemical hangover of too much adrenaline. She felt fragile, like a glass dropped on a tile floor that hadn't quite shattered yet. Moving toward the bathroom, she splashed freezing water on her face, avoiding her own hollow-eyed reflection in the mirror. She didn't want to see the victim today. She needed to be hard. She needed to figure out how to get from this penthouse back to her cramped apartment without Derek intercepting her on the street. Stepping out into the main hallway, the absolute quiet of the suite pressed against her ears. She limped toward the living area, half expecting it to be empty. It wasn't. Dominic sat at the massive marble island. He was already dressed in a sharp navy suit, though he had discarded the jacket and tie. His crisp white sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, exposing the dark, intricate ink wrapping around his forearms. He was typing on a sleek silver laptop, his focus absolute and predatory. A steaming ceramic mug sat near his left hand, filling the space with the dark, bitter scent of black espresso. He didn't look up as her bare feet whispered across the floorboards. "There is a paper bag on the sofa." His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that scraped pleasantly against the quiet. Nora stopped. She looked over at the charcoal grey leather couch where she had bled the night before. A brown, unmarked shopping bag sat precisely in the center of the middle cushion. She walked over, favoring her good leg, and peered inside. Folded neatly at the bottom was a pair of dark denim jeans, a plain black cashmere sweater, and a pair of simple soft leather flats. Tucked into the collar of the sweater was a small, unmarked white envelope. Her stomach gave a strange, complicated flutter. The clothing was entirely anonymous, yet the fact that it was here, acquired before she even woke up, was terrifying. It meant men had been dispatched. It meant her approximate size had been calculated, judged, and communicated. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice sounding raspy and thin. Dominic finally stopped typing. He closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click and turned his dark eyes toward her. The morning light didn't soften his features. It merely highlighted the harsh, aristocratic angles of his jaw and the flat, unforgiving depth of his stare. "You could hardly walk out of this building in a torn slip dress without drawing attention," he stated, picking up his espresso. "Attention is messy. I despise mess." Nora tightened her grip on the edge of the paper bag. "Right. It's about keeping the lobby clean." "Precisely." He took a slow sip of the dark liquid. "Change. There is a car waiting downstairs in the private garage. The driver has instructions to take you wherever you need to go within the city limits. Do not give him an address. Give him an intersection. Walk the rest of the way." The cold, tactical nature of his instructions sent a chill racing down her spine. He wasn't giving her a ride. He was executing a secure extraction. She picked up the bag and carried it back to the guest room. Pulling on the jeans, she found they fit perfectly. The cashmere sweater was impossibly soft against her bruised skin, swallowing her in a heavy, expensive warmth. She opened the small white envelope. Inside were 5 crisp $100 bills. No note, no phone number. Just clean, untraceable cash. A sharp, cynical laugh caught in her throat. She was being paid off. Or more accurately, she was being given severance for surviving a night in his orbit. When she returned to the living room fully dressed, the envelope was clutched in her hand. She walked to the marble island and placed the money gently on the smooth stone next to his laptop. Dominic glanced at the cash, then up at her. His expression remained entirely unreadable. "I don't need your money," Nora said, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. "I just needed a door to close." "Pride is a luxury for people who aren't being hunted," Dominic murmured, not touching the bills. "Take it. You will likely need to break your lease." "I'll manage." He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the atmospheric pressure dropping sharply. He wasn't used to being defied, not even in trivial matters. But instead of anger, a flicker of dark, calculating interest shadowed his eyes. "Suit yourself," he said softly. He gestured toward the heavy oak doors. "The elevator is unlocked. The driver is in the black sedan. Good luck, Nora." He used her name. Hearing it in his low, resonant voice felt like a physical touch. She swallowed hard, nodded once and turned her back on him, limping out of the penthouse and into the waiting elevator, leaving the safety of his cage behind. Heat radiated from the concrete the second Nora stepped out of the tinted, air-conditioned interior of the black sedan. The driver, a massive man with a thick neck and completely dead eyes, hadn't spoken a single word during the 20-minute ride across the city. He had simply unlocked the doors when they reached the intersection she specified 3 blocks away from her apartment building. The air smelled like hot asphalt, stale garbage from the nearby alley and exhaust fumes. It was a suffocating, gritty contrast to the filtered cedar-scented oxygen of the Casio penthouse. Nora stood on the corner, waiting for the sedan to pull away before she moved. The heavy cashmere sweater was entirely inappropriate for the humid morning, making a prickle of sweat break out across her lower back. But she kept her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. It felt like armor. She began the walk to her building. Every step sent a jolt of pain up her bruised right leg. She kept her head down her eyes, darting nervously toward every parked car, every shadowy doorway, every broad-shouldered man walking in her direction. Dominic had said Derek was nursing a fractured cheekbone, but Derek was a creature fueled by spite. Pain wouldn't stop him. It would just act as an accelerant. She turned the corner onto her street. Her apartment building was a narrow, dirty brick structure, crammed between a dry cleaner and a failing bodega. The front door hadn't locked properly in 3 years. Pushing through the heavy glass door, she bypassed the narrow, creaking elevator. She didn't think she could handle being in a metal box right now, and took the stairs to the 3rd floor. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with her keys. She dropped them twice, the sharp jingle echoing far too loudly in the dingy hallway. Finally, the deadbolt clicked. She pushed inside and slammed the door behind her, immediately throwing the deadbolt the chain lock and dragging a heavy wooden dining chair under the knob. The apartment was exactly as she left it yesterday morning, yet it felt entirely alien. It smelled of stale coffee and the cheap vanilla candles she burned to cover up the scent of the neighbor's cigarette smoke. It was cramped, cluttered, and painfully vulnerable. Nora slumped against the front door, sliding down the peeling paint until she hit the scuffed linoleum floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in the soft cashmere of the sweater. For 10 minutes, she just sat there, listening to the heavy, erratic thud of her own heartbeat. Then she noticed the blinking red light on her cheap digital answering machine across the room. 14 messages. She squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to listen. She wanted to rip the cord out of the wall, but the not knowing was worse. She dragged herself across the floor, reached up and pressed play. Beep. Nora. Pick up the phone. I know you're not at work. Where the hell did you go? Derek's voice was slurred, thick with lingering alcohol and immediate rage. Beep. You think you can just run away? Huh. You embarrassed me. You made me look like a fool in front of... The audio muffled for a second, followed by a heavy crash. Pick up the damn phone. Beep. The messages progressed over the course of the night. They shifted from screaming anger to pathetic, wet sobbing. He promised he loved her. He promised he would change. Then came the final message, time-stamped at 4:15 a.m. Beep. Derek's voice was different this time. It wasn't slurred. It was dead sober, eerily calm, and terrifyingly tight. The sound of his breathing was ragged, as if he were fighting through immense physical pain. I found out whose floor that elevator went to Nora. The bartender talks. You think you're safe because you spent the night with some rich prick. You think he cares about you. He's going to throw you out. And when he does, I'm going to find you. You're mine. You hear me? I don't care who he is. You belong to me. The machine clicked off, leaving a heavy ringing silence in the cramped apartment. Nora stared at the flashing red 0 on the display. A cold, absolute dread settled in the pit of her stomach, freezing her blood. He didn't care who Dominic Cassio was. Derek was too arrogant, too small-minded to understand the kind of danger he was provoking. He only understood his own bruised ego. He wouldn't stop. He would wait outside her job. He would wait in the alley behind her building. He would catch her when she was alone. She looked down at her hands. They were pale and trembling. She looked at the stark white square of gauze perfectly taped to her bicep. The police wouldn't help her. She had tried that route a year ago. They took a report, gave her a pamphlet, and told her to call back if he actually broke down her door. By the time they arrived, she would already be broken. She slowly stood up. The pain in her ankle barely registered any more. A chilling, crystalline clarity washed over her. The kind of clarity that only comes when you realize you have absolutely nothing left to lose. She couldn't outrun Derek. She didn't have the money, the resources, or the physical strength. He was a rabid dog, and he was already tracking her scent. There was only one place in the entire city where a rabid dog wouldn't dare bare its teeth. A penthouse in the sky, guarded by men in tailored suits, owned by a monster who found her survival instincts amusing. Nora walked into her tiny bedroom. She pulled a worn canvas duffel bag from the closet and threw it on the mattress. She didn't pack photos. She didn't pack knickknacks. She packed socks, underwear, a few worn t-shirts, and her toothbrush. She zipped the bag shut. It weighed almost nothing. It was the entire sum of her life. She was going back. Not to ask for charity. Not to beg. Dominic Cassio despised weakness. She was going back to make a deal with the devil. Because the devil, at the very least, kept his house perfectly secure. Heat rose off the asphalt in suffocating waves, distorting the luxury sedans idling outside the hotel. Nora ignored the sweat sliding down her spine beneath the cashmere sweater. Her faded duffel dug a rough groove into her shoulder. Leaning into the revolving doors, she was hit instantly by refrigerated air and the cloying scent of white orchids. It had been 2 hours since she left this polished lobby. It felt like a lifetime. The daytime concierge looked up from his monitor as she limped toward the desk. His practiced smile faltered, taking in her bruised, ankle-pale face and the cheap canvas bag. She looked like a problem he was paid to keep out. "May I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone rigid, designed to usher vagrants back out. "I need to send a message to the penthouse," Nora said. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, forcing the gravel out. "To Dominic Cassio." The concierge froze. His professional mask slipped, replaced by genuine panic. His hand stilled on the keyboard. His eyes darted over her shoulder, checking the lobby to see who might have heard her drop that specific name. "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that." "Tell him Nora is downstairs," she interrupted, dropping into a flat demand. She didn't have energy for protocol. Her adrenaline was gone, replaced by cold desperation. "Tell him I brought his envelope back." She stepped away before he could offer a rehearsed denial and dropped onto an emerald green sofa. She set the bag between her feet. Every muscle vibrated with exhaustion. Derek's voicemail played on a continuous loop. "I don't care who he is. You belong to me." 10 agonizing minutes crawled by. The ambient jazz sounded like rusted metal grinding. Nora stared blindly at the marble floor, trying to keep her breathing even. A heavy shadow blocked the warm glow of the chandeliers. She looked up. It was the massive guard with the jagged scar slicing through his eyebrow. He wore a tight black t-shirt, revealing the thick muscle of his arms and a shoulder holster pressed against his ribs. He didn't speak, simply giving a definitive nod toward the private elevators. Nora stood biting her cheek as her right ankle screamed in protest. She followed his broad back. The ride-up was silent. Nora watched the digital display tick upward, stomach plummeting. She was doing something irrevocably stupid. She had packed the sum total of her life into a cheap bag, walking back into a tiger's cage to hide from a rabid dog. When the doors opened, the guard stepped aside. The oak doors at the end of the corridor were ajar, spilling pale sunlight onto the carpet. Nora crossed the threshold. The massive suite was cast in the stark light of the mid-afternoon sun. Without the shadows of night, the room looked like a sterile vault. Dominic stood by the windows, his back to her. He had changed into tailored trousers and a slate-grey shirt sleeves rolled up to expose the heavy ink on his forearms. He held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid and a single cube of ice. He didn't turn when her shoes scuffed against the hardwood. He took a slow sip. "You are remarkably bad at following instructions." Nora dropped her duffel bag. It hit the floor with a pathetic thud. Reaching into her borrowed jeans, she pulled out the envelope and tossed it onto the glass table. It landed with a soft slap. "I can't outrun him," Nora said, her voice steady. "He left a voicemail. He knows I came up here last night. Derek is arrogant and stupid enough to not care whose building this is. He is waiting for me." Dominic finally turned. The harsh sunlight illuminated the complete lack of surprise in his dark eyes. He looked at the cheap bag, the envelope, and finally his gaze settled heavily on her face. "And your tactical solution is to return to a man who explicitly told you to disappear?" he asked. "My solution is to find the one place where a drunk bully can't kick the door in," she replied, holding his gaze. "You told me loud men rely on fear. Take away the fear and they are just meat making noise. I need your doors, Dominic." Dominic's jaw tightened. He walked slowly across the room, his leather soles making no sound. He stopped inches from her. The overwhelming scent of cedar and cold smoke wrapped around her, instantly terrifyingly secure. "I do not run a charity for strays," he stated softly. "If you stay behind my doors, you operate under my rules. You do not leave without permission. You do not speak to anyone about what happens here. Your life, your safety, and your loyalty belong to this house." The word belong echoed violently. Derek used it as a chain. Dominic stated it as an ironclad contract. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, fists balled to stop her trembling. Dominic raised his right hand. He simply traced the calloused knuckles of his index finger down her pale cheek, stopping below her jaw. His touch was cold, heavy, and paralyzingly gentle. "I want," he murmured, his dark eyes stripping away her remaining defenses, "to see exactly what a cornered animal is capable of when she finally stops running." Nora didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, letting out a ragged breath as the gravity of his dark world pulled her under for good. "Okay," she breathed. "Nora has stopped running, but stepping into Dominic Cassio's dark, controlled world might be more dangerous than the abusive past she left behind. She just traded a chaotic monster for a cold, calculated one. What rules will Dominic force her to follow? And what happens when Derek inevitably tries to break down the untouchable doors of the Cassio Empire? The real war is just beginning. If you were captivated by Nora's desperate choice and want to see how she navigates this lethal new dynamic, smash that like, button, share this video, and subscribe so you don't miss part 10.